Kelley at the appropriate time, and it is time. So I want to introduce. I'm going to hold this up, see if you can see it. Kelley Gunter is our first presenter, and she wrote "You Have Such a Pretty Face," and I'm in the process of reading it, but I did cheat, and I wanted to read you a quote, and she'll tell you lots more, but throughout my healing journey, I finally began to feel that I was worthy, that I was enough, that I deserved genuine love and kindness from everyone in my life, and especially from the man I was involved with. I am living proof you can heal and you can begin to love yourself. That resonated with me because I too, in recovery, learned that I was worthy and that I was enough. So it brings tears to my eyes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kelley. She's going to introduce herself. Oh, I wanted to tell you. So at the top of your screen, you'll see Maintaining Sobriety. That's the presentation. You can download that and follow along. If you try to go to the one requesting to share, I'm going to I'm going to decline that. So any questions, please feel free to IM me. I will ask them. But if you do not get offended, if you try to request a share, like now, I'm just going to hit X and you're not going to get a chance to do that. So I'll keep doing that if you keep doing that. But if you just IM me, I will ask the question. So I'm going to toggle my audio off. Kelley Gunter is your first presenter. Thank you for being with us today, Kelley.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I think that this is such an important community and such an important topic because we never really know what someone else's reality is. We can know someone their entire lives and not really ever know what is going on inside of them. This is especially true for victims of sexual abuse. Because of the powerful shame that is associated with it, victims will push that pain down deep inside and never tell a single soul. I know. I did that for 45 years of my life. A woman who had read my book reached out to me on Facebook Messenger, and she left me a message telling me that she had been happily married to her best friend for 30 years. Her message actually read, "I've never told him or anyone else that I was sexually abused." So there it is. I was sexually abused. I've said it. Thank you for sharing your truth because it gave me the courage to share mine with you. I may never tell another person again, but at least it's off my soul now. The message just overwhelmed me. She has been married to her best friend for 30 years and never told him that she was abused as a child. Clearly, it has haunted her. It's been painful for her, and yet she held on to that secret all this time. That is how powerful the shame that is associated with sexual abuse can be. In my book, I say, I don't know everything. I don't even know a lot of things, but I do know some things. And one thing I know for sure is this book hasn't ended up in your hands by accident. It's the same thing with you being here today. You are here for a reason. There is something you meant to hear in this presentation. Sexual abuse is like an earthquake that happens in a child's life. When an earthquake hits, there is the initial destruction, but later, after the earthquake, there are aftershocks that hit. And the aftershocks are sometimes just as hazardous as the main quake itself. In fact, aftershocks can sometimes be so strong that they're stronger than the main quake ever was. If we are comparing sexual abuse with a child, I'm not talking just about rape or whatever, but we're talking about childhood sexual abuse. If we compare childhood sexual abuse with an earthquake, then the trauma that's left is the aftershocks that go through a child's life. Some of those aftershocks are just as powerful and damaging as the original abuse. Maintaining sobriety can be incredibly difficult while dealing with the resurfacing trauma and all of its complexities. Learning to navigate through those obstacles while maintaining our sobriety is going to be the focus of the presentation today. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I was abused in my own home by my older brothers from the time I was 7 until I was 14. There were other perpetrators of abuse against me as well, but the majority of my abuse came from within the walls of what should have been my safe haven, my own home. How many rape victims have to have dinner at night with the person who raped them in the morning? How many rape victims have to hand their rapist a Christmas present? That is the truth of the duality of the horror that children who are sexually abused in their own homes live with every single day. The sexual abuse that I suffered throughout all of my formative years, abuse that was never disclosed, never discussed or allowed to heal, became the catalyst for a lifetime of self-destructive behaviors and numerous addictions, which ultimately brought on the complete destruction of my life. After losing everything I had worked my entire career to attain, a business I had founded, my home, my cars, all of my belongings, my family, and my friends, I went into treatment. I had never been in treatment before, and as with many victims, it was during my stay there that I eventually disclosed the sexual abuse that I'd suffered throughout the entirety of my childhood. It was an incredibly difficult but significant disclosure, and as a result, I remained in treatment longer than originally anticipated. It was incredibly painful to speak about secrets that I had kept hidden in my heart for over 40 years. I had been terrified to ever disclose that truth. I couldn't share it with anyone. Acknowledging past abuse is so important in treatment because it breaks the secrecy and shame that are so often partnered with abuse. I think it's important to point out here that I have a master's degree in counseling and was a licensed professional for 28 years. In spite of my education and experience, I couldn't draw the correlation between the abuse I had suffered and my own self-destructive behaviors. I couldn't connect those dots. We can't heal what we don't acknowledge. And eventually, the very thing that I was running to ended up hurting me just as much as the abuse I was running from. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't run fast enough to escape myself. And at that point, regardless of the trauma that I had suffered in my childhood, as an adult, I had become the problem. Trauma doesn't magically get better with time. Time doesn't heal anything. It doesn't. And as painful as it is to accept, healing is our responsibility. The bottom line is this: a wound is a wound, and our scars, even the invisible ones, remind us it happened. I had a friend who broke a bone in her leg, but she didn't realize it at the time. She hobbled around for several weeks thinking it was just a bad sprain. Months later, when she finally went to the doctor, an x-ray revealed that not only had she broken her leg, but in all of the time that she had been ignoring those painful symptoms, the bone had healed incorrectly. So now they had to go in and re-break and reset the bone so it could heal correctly, or she would never be able to walk pain-free or without a limp. It's the same way with trauma. Trying to ignore pain or self-medicating through addiction doesn't allow your soul to heal correctly. You have to go in and reset things so you can heal and live in the healthiest way possible. There is a strong correlation between childhood sexual abuse and addiction. Female survivors of childhood sexual abuse are 3 times more likely, and male survivors are 2.6 times more likely than a person who didn't experience childhood trauma to report substance abuse problems. So eventually, many survivors end up in some type of treatment. And while treatment is a place that numerous people do disclose their abuse for the first time, there are many survivors, because of the shame that surrounds sexual abuse. Because of that, many of them still never disclose their trauma. If you're a survivor of sexual abuse, whether you've ever disclosed that trauma or not, there are many things in this presentation that will hopefully give you some insight into your healing and moving forward. So you've gone through treatment, or there's been an intervention, and you're working hard to get things right and hold on to that sobriety. But you discover quickly that healing from that trauma is much more complex than you ever anticipated. And here's one possible reason why. Studies have shown that recovery from substance abuse is even more difficult for people who were abused as children. People who were sexually abused often develop PTSD, and this disorder increases the risk of relapse because it engenders intrusive memories and attempts to avoid those memories through self-medication. Once you've disclosed abuse, or you're working on it in treatment, basically you've ripped that wound wide open because that's the only way to clean out the pain that has been festering there. So the very pain that you had been trying to escape, most likely for the entirety of your life, now is even more excruciating than it ever was before, because once you start sorting through nightmares and flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, those can completely become overwhelming. You may even think the pain is worse now than it ever was before. And that's true in healing. Things feel worse before they get better. But now you're not using those old methods of addiction, trying to numb that pain. So you're just learning new healthy coping skills. And many people that I work with have said to me, Kelley, like, it's at this point that I feel my most fragile. Like I feel like I could just lose it all. And that does put you in grave danger of relapsing and developing a new addiction. It can be overwhelming when you start the healing process. So let's look at some of the issues that survivors of trauma may face and appropriate ways to handle them. Ways that will help you maintain your sobriety, because the better you learn to cope with the trauma, the less likely it is that it will have a negative effect on your sobriety. And I do life coaching, and many of my clients tell me that the biggest thing they felt as a victim, the worst overwhelming feeling that they had, was they felt so isolated. And because of the shame that is associated with being a victim of sexual abuse, the correlating silence that just strangles people's voices, this prevents victims from ever disclosing. And survivors have a tendency, as a result, to feel very alone, like they are the only ones this has ever happened to. I can remember sitting in my classroom in the 3rd grade and looking at my friends, just looking around at them and thinking, does this happen to her? That feeling of isolation can be the catalyst for a survivor to feel anxious, hopeless, worthless, and depressed. All of those feelings are factors that can trigger a relapse. So let's take a look at the actual numbers of victims really quick. According to statistics published by the American Psychological Association from a study that was completed by the CDC, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused in the United States before they reach the age of 18. More recent studies state that the number of boys who are abused is closer to 1 in 4, but males are even less likely to report than females. So those are staggering numbers, though. Let's look at those numbers and apply them to the population in the United States today. There are approximately 162 million males and 171 million females. Even if we go with the number of 1 in 6 male victims, that's 27 million male victims and 57 million female victims. Put those together, that's 84 million survivors of sexual abuse in the United States alone. And yet victims feel as if they're the only one. If you begin to have feelings that you're the only one, remember these statistics. You are not alone. Knowing that others suffered as well doesn't change or minimize your trauma, but educating society on just how rampant the problem of sexual abuse is in this country will hopefully begin to lessen some of the shame and secrecy that surrounds it. Another heartbreaking statistic reported by the National Association of Adult Survivors of Child Abuse is that 90% of survivors of sexual abuse have never disclosed their abuse to anyone. That is so troubling because we can't heal what we don't acknowledge. If we take the number of 84 million survivors of sexual abuse and 90% of them have never spoken of the abuse to anyone, that says that over 75 million survivors have most likely never begun to heal from that trauma. And then is it any surprise that we have so many people attempting to self-medicate? So let's look at addiction responsibility versus abuse responsibility. A very common difficulty that many experience is that in treatment, we are taught to take responsibility for our actions and focus on the part we played in our addiction and the choices we made. In treatment for sexual abuse, however, we are reminded that the blame for the sexual abuse resides with the perpetrator. These are two very opposing views, and when we're trying to heal from abuse and establish or maintain sobriety at the same time, this can produce anxiety and some confusion for some people. It's important here to remind ourselves, my using is something I had some control over. My abuse and the actions of others, I don't. When we are dealing with stress and feeling anxious, it's easy for our thoughts to get a little jumbled up sometimes. So you might want to write that down in a journal somewhere so that when you have dark days or you're really stressed, you can remind yourself if those thoughts begin to overlap a little, because it happens a lot with some people. Survivors have difficulty externalizing the abuse. We can tend to think negatively about ourselves, and after years of negative self-thoughts, we sometimes have feelings of worthlessness, and we believe that we have nothing of value to offer anyone. Some survivors take personal responsibility for the abuse. They blame themselves, which causes them to internalize erroneous negative messages about themselves. And then what happens is we have self-destructive behaviors, suicidal ideation, anxiety, tension, relationship problems, denial, shame, guilt, phobia, depression. I mean, anything you can think of. All those things rise. And as they rise, the chances of maintaining our sobriety plummets. After a lifetime of believing that the abuse was your fault, you don't just hear someone say to you, it wasn't your fault, and magically you absorb that feeling. This is why it is really helpful to be in some type of healing program for yourself, to have assistance in learning to reshape those thought patterns. If you're one of those survivors who feel like the abuse was your fault, understanding that the abuse was not your fault, what seems like a simple concept, is so crucial to minimizing the factors that put your sobriety at risk. I can tell you from my own personal experience, as well as my 28 years of professional experience, this is one of the hardest realities for survivors to embrace. It's a major stumbling block for a lot of people. Understanding it cognitively is one thing. Understanding and absorbing it in your soul, that place where you keep the things that you don't talk to other people about, that's something entirely different. And that is where you have to begin to absorb that it wasn't your fault. Let's go over some of the most common erroneous thoughts that survivors have regarding their abuse. Many of my clients speak of these all the time. It doesn't matter if, like me, you didn't tell, or you didn't keep trying to tell once someone didn't believe you. That's not your fault. If you loved or still love your abuser, many victims did and do love their abusers. That doesn't mean that you didn't hate the abuse and that you didn't desperately want the abuse to stop. Having love for your abuser does not mean it was your fault. It wasn't. If you liked the attention because otherwise you were completely neglected and ignored, perpetrators use that tactic against victims. That's not your fault. If the abuse continued into your teen years and you didn't tell, that's not your fault. That's a pattern of abuse. It doesn't matter if your body responded. This is a big one with some survivors. That's a physical response. Physical response does not signify consent. That's not something you can control. It was not your fault. If you were drunk or high when the abuse happened, still not your fault. If your abuser was drunk or high when they abused you, it's still their fault. There literally are infinite reasons survivors can feel that the abuse was their fault. Learning to change those thoughts and internalize the fact that the abuse was not your fault is crucial to moving forward in healing. It's so important that you're able to let go of that and release that blame from your soul, because it weighs you down, it slows your healing process, and really being able to process it and own it is really powerful. So let's talk about your attitude about and understanding of trauma. When you think about your own trauma, it's so easy to say, certainly what happened in my life and my childhood hasn't controlled me throughout the journey I've been on. And then you may have friends or family who minimize it and say things like, it's not really that traumatic. It happened in your childhood. Let it go. Get over it. Move on. We've all had people say that to us. I can tell you this, unhealed trauma will sit in the control room of your soul, dictating all the calamities of your life. One study compared the PTSD symptoms of Vietnam veterans and adult survivors of sexual abuse. The study revealed that the childhood sexual abuse was every bit as traumatizing and resulted in symptoms comparable to symptoms from war-related trauma. Understand that your trauma is real. It can be debilitating, and many people in the world are simply uninformed about the subject. Educate yourself You need to know all that you can know about trauma. You need to have a very clear understanding of the long-term effects of the trauma, because it's crucial when you need to stand strong in your truth when other people attempt to minimize it. Having those kind of people around you can be very disruptive to your healing. It's important to have a strong group of people to support you. You have to choose your circle carefully. You will lose some people along the way. That's a certainty. And I think we've all learned in recovery that not everyone who's sitting on our bench is actually on our team. Not everyone you lose is a loss. I'm not suggesting cut everyone out of your life who doesn't understand, because there will be a lot of people who just don't get it. That's just truth. But some of those people will want to learn. And those are the kinds of people that you want on your team. Take time to help your loved ones understand what you're experiencing and be honest about how they can help you. Be honest about your needs. Learning to trust and ask for help are significant obstacles. I get that. I've been there. But they are very important in your healing journey. Learning to say, this is what I need, is a big step for survivors. So let's look at some coping mechanisms and coping skills that we can use when we have trauma in our life and we're trying to move forward. When healing from sexual abuse, most victims have to begin extinguishing old coping skills and learning to implement new ones. This doesn't happen overnight, and obviously our coping skills in the past have not included the healthiest choices. My method of coping was jumping from addiction to addiction to addiction. I was trying desperately to avoid my truth and numb my pain. It's important to have healthy coping skills to help us deal with those aftershocks when they hit us. Ask yourself, what is my truth? I use this one a lot. Literally, I found myself at times using this on an hourly basis. Owning our truth is essential for healing, especially for those of us who learn to lie as a survival skill. I learned that if I lied at school and said I was sick, the school would call my mom. She would come and get me from school, and she would take me back to work with her because I was too young to stay home alone. This allowed me to escape being home alone with my teenage brothers after school. That survival skill turned into a very unhealthy coping mechanism as an adult. I had to learn to replace it with truth. Seriously, on a daily basis, I had to ask myself, do I want to live in the truth? Do I want to change and have a better life? I had lived my entire life with a constant fear of rejection. I had to learn to be vulnerable and speak how I was genuinely feeling, knowing that regardless of what the results were, I could handle them. Whatever they were, I would be okay. Get rid of those rationalizations, justifications, and explanations. Those were skills that helped you survive, but they're outdated now. They aren't useful anymore, and you have to begin to live daily in your truth. Another thing that is so important for many survivors is to feel safe. Many survivors struggle with feelings of fear, powerlessness, and vulnerability. Some experience hypervigilance, which is an enhanced state of sensory sensitivity. Basically, that means that your brain, specifically the amygdala, stays on high alert. This was a big one for me. When I was a young adult and I would return home from a night out with friends, I still lived at home with my parents, and I would ask my friends who were dropping me off to come inside the house with me and make sure I wasn't walking into some type of gruesome crime scene. I was always worried I would come in and find my parents dead. My friends just always laughed it off. They came inside with me. They said, oh, she's seen one too many horror movies. They always did it, and then they'd go home. But my brain was stuck on high alert, always expecting the unthinkable. As a result, you're unable to relax, and that difficulty in trusting anything can be very debilitating. So learning to become safe becomes incredibly important. One of the ways to do this is to challenge your sense of helplessness. Sometimes 12-step programs can be challenging for survivors of sexual abuse because many feel as they have no control and no power. Don't let that be an excuse to drop out of a 12-step program that is saving your life. This doesn't mean that a 12-step program can't work for you. You just need to express those feelings, discuss them, feel them, work through them. It's important to remind yourself you do have strengths, you have coping skills, and they will get you through tough times. Recognize that strength. Just the fact that you have disclosed the abuse and are beginning to work through it requires an inordinate amount of strength. One way to reclaim your sense of power is by helping others. This is a big one. Many survivors will volunteer at animal shelters. They join support groups. Consider joining a support group. Survivors many times feel like they've always been on the outside, that they just didn't fit anywhere. Being involved in support groups can help build the sense of loss of attachment that many survivors feel. You'll feel less isolated. You'll feel less alone. Remember that connections take time, but they are a powerful part of healing and maintaining sobriety. Spend time interacting with people. This makes a significant difference in your mood and in your outlook. Consider taking a class, writing, painting, working with animals, whatever it is. Join a church. Anything that promotes the feeling of belonging and feeling safe will be helpful. Groups also provide great information on coping symptoms, and members share individual ways that they work towards recovery. Obviously, online groups such as this one are a great way to interact and do this well. It takes away the intimidation of meeting people in person, and a lot of survivors struggle with that insecure feeling, so online is a powerful tool. Know the environments you feel safe in and the people you feel safe with. Avoid people and situations where you don't feel safe. Establish clear boundaries and stick to them. If you're not comfortable doing something or going somewhere, don't do it. And don't feel bad about not doing it. As a survivor, your boundaries were destroyed as a child. And so many times building boundaries is a big step in the healing process. Part of developing healthy boundaries is learning to say no. Many survivors struggle with flashbacks and upsetting memories. So because this is such a crucial one, I wanted to cover this here. Beginning to identify and understand the intensity of your feelings is crucial. This will help you to recognize your triggers. If we aren't aware of them and don't know how to handle them, they may eventually have us spiraling downward and possibly reaching for the unhealthy things, people, and substances we have previously abandoned. We need to begin to anticipate and prepare for our triggers. A lot of people may not know what is a trigger. In recent years, too, this term has become casually used to refer to the experiences of having an emotional reaction, usually to some type of disturbing content, maybe violence in the media. But there is a big difference between being uncomfortable and being triggered. Feeling triggered isn't just about something rubbing you the wrong way. For someone who has a history of sexual abuse or trauma, a trigger is anything that can make them feel as if they're experiencing the trauma all over again. Triggers are very different for each person, and they can be internal or they can be external. Just like it sounds, an internal trigger comes from within us. It can be a memory, a physical sensation, or an emotion. Some examples of common internal triggers can be pain or memories tied to a traumatic event, anger, sadness, feeling abandoned, overwhelmed, muscle tension. One that several of my clients has mentioned to me is that when they exercise and they're short of breath and their heart is pounding really hard, they're reminded of when they were physically fighting or running away from a person or a traumatic event after it had happened. External triggers come from the outside environment. They can be a person, place, or a specific situation. Common triggers include the anniversary date of when the trauma initially occurred, people or places associated with the abuse, certain sights, sounds, or smells. For some people, a specific time of the day can be a trigger. If you are aware of what triggers cause an upsetting reaction, you'll be in a better position to understand what's happening and take steps immediately to begin to calm down. The tricky thing about triggers is that they can cause an emotional reaction before a person realizes why they've even become upset. They can sneak up on you and you're all worked up and you don't even know what it's about. That's why it's so important to become familiar with your triggers so that you can recognize the situations you need to avoid. It is reasonable to try to avoid triggering situations, But if avoiding triggers hinders your ability to function, then you need to learn to use coping skills to get through so you can be as prepared as you can be. Learning to cope with triggers you can't anticipate or avoid requires emotional processing, which is often a very powerful part of individual therapy. Pay attention to your body's danger signals. Your body sends you messages all day long. Your body and the emotions give you clues when you're starting to feel stressed and unsafe. These clues include feeling tense, holding your breath maybe, racing thoughts, shortness of your breath, gritting your teeth perhaps, hot flashes, dizziness, nausea. People all feel different things. When you notice any of these symptoms, it's important to take immediate steps to self-soothe. It's important to quickly act to calm yourself down before these symptoms spiral out of control and you're tempted to reach for something to stop the pain. One of the quickest and most effective ways to calm anxiety and panic is to slow down your breathing. Inhale slowly and deeply through your nose, keep your shoulders relaxed, and exhale slowly through your mouth. Just keep repeating this, focusing only on the breathing that you're doing. It sounds really simple, but it genuinely helps. Empower yourself by preparing to cope with triggers. The ultimate goal is to detach yourself from the trigger, recenter, and focus on your coping strategy. Now let's talk about tips for dealing with flashbacks. A flashback is a vivid experience in which you relive some aspects of a traumatic event or you feel as if it's happening again right now. This can sometimes be like watching a video of what happened, but flashbacks don't necessarily involve seeing images or reliving the event from start to finish. You may maintain some connection with the present moment, or you may lose all awareness of what's going on around you and be taken completely back to the traumatic event. Flashbacks are very individual and very different for every person. It's not always possible to prevent flashbacks, but if you find yourself losing touch with the present and feeling the abuse is happening all over again, there are actions you can take. Ground yourself in the present. Grounding techniques can help you direct your attention away from the flashback and back to your present environment. To connect back with the here and now, you want to do something that will bring all of your attention to the present moment. When using grounding techniques, you want to use one of the 5 senses: sound, touch, taste, smell, and sight. For sight, you can immediately take an inventory of everything around you. Connect with the present moment by listing everything you see. Identify all of the items, just list them out loud. For smell, many people I know keep strong peppermint with them everywhere they go. When you smell something strong, it's very hard to focus on anything else. You just smell that and it's overwhelming. Smelling peppermint can bring you back to the present moment. Some survivors turn on really loud music that's impossible to ignore, and that brings them back to the present moment. One of my favorites, one that I've utilized and that a lot of my clients utilize, is sense of touch. Some survivors will hold ice in their hands and focus on the cold sensation to remain in the present. Taste is another one. Survivors will bite into a wedge of lemon, and that sour taste in their mouth immediately brings them back to the present here and now. All of these things cause your brain to shift and focus on something else that is in the present moment, thus ending the flashback. The essential thing is to be prepared. If you're experiencing flashbacks, have some of these items ready. Try the different ones. See what works best for you, what allows you to all of a sudden be concretely in the here and now. Know these steps. Try them. Accept and reassure yourself this is a flashback, not reality. The traumatic event is over and you survived. Remind yourself that the assault is not actually happening and you're not actually in danger at this moment. That really, really helps people to focus on that after they've came back to the here and now. Intrusive thoughts is another situation that people have to deal with. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that seem to become stuck in your mind. They can cause distress. The nature of the thought itself may be upsetting. They can reoccur frequently, which makes the concern worse. They may or may not be about the trauma or any abuse. And many people have intrusive thoughts about a multitude of things. There are numerous techniques to help with these. You can Google those, but I'm going to talk about one that I have utilized, that I still utilize, and it really works well for me. And if you want to Google them, they're called thought-stopping techniques. One that I use is that as soon as I have an intrusive thought, I say stop out loud, very firmly, and at the same time, I visualize a stop sign. Then I have a pre-planned thought of something that is pleasant for me, something that works for me. For me, it's birthday cake. I laugh about that, but it actually really works for me. I imagine the exact kind of cake, what it looks like. I imagine what the bite of the cake tastes like, what the texture of the cake itself is like, what the frosting's like, what the frosting's texture is. I imagine chewing it and tasting it. There are so many different components to that thought that my brain becomes fixated on the cake and the intrusive thought is gone. One of the worst symptoms for me that I had to deal with was nightmares. Many survivors of sexual abuse who have been diagnosed with PTSD report experiencing flashbacks in the form of nightmares. These are considered a hallmark of the disorder. These nightmares can be experienced years after the abuse. The nightmares are incredibly disturbing. They wake a person up and it leaves you feeling as if you just experienced the trauma again, just now. Intense negative emotions can be the result of that, and they leave a person feeling fear, anger, and sadness. These nightmares can cause significant distress, and they can occur very frequently. Some survivors report the nightmares happen at least 5 times a week. For me, these post-traumatic nightmares were very regular and very debilitating. They're much more intense than regular dreams, and they're very similar to flashbacks experienced while you're awake. They can contain replays of the actual traumatic event, or they could be symbolic of the event as well. The feeling you have is the same. Obviously, these are so debilitating for survivors. You're woken up in the middle of the night. You can't go back to sleep. It disrupts your sleep patterns. One study that was completed shows that 40 years after a traumatic event, many survivors who were diagnosed with PTSD were still experiencing replicating nightmares of the trauma they experienced as children. When you experience nightmares like these, it can be helpful to utilize the grounding techniques I spoke of earlier, as well as the breathing exercises. It is believed that recurrent nightmares are representative of unresolved conflict regarding the trauma, and that the cessation of nightmares is associated with increased psychological well-being. As you heal, hopefully the nightmares begin to dissipate. I used to have very severe nightmares of the trauma that I experienced in my childhood, and I had them on a regular basis. After going into treatment 4 years ago, I rarely have nightmares anymore. Taking the time, working through and processing that trauma has made all of the difference in the world for me. Many of the symptoms that used to plague me daily have either been completely eliminated or they occur very rarely. It's important for victims to learn to be able to nurture themselves. Healing from trauma is a gradual, ongoing process. It doesn't happen overnight, nor do the memories of the trauma ever completely disappear. This can make life seem difficult at times, but there are many steps you can take to cope with the residual symptoms and reduce your anxiety and fear. What does nurturing yourself look like? Take time to rest and restore your body's balance. This means taking a break when you're tired. Avoid doing anything compulsively, including working. Your body can't calm down when you're go, go, go. Talk to a sympathetic listener. This is a big one. It's important to have people in our circle who we can trust and who we can talk to. This is where support groups also become very, very valuable. Take care of yourself physically. I know already there's a bunch of you rolling your eyes on this one, but it's important to eat right, exercise regularly, and get plenty of sleep. This seems very elementary, but there are more people out there struggling with doing this than people getting it right. As important as it is to calm your mind, it's equally as important to get your body moving. This can look different for all of us. I'm not saying, hey, go get a gym membership, go all out. But exercise helps to regulate our mood and emotions. And research has shown that exercise helps our brain to better cope with stress. Psychologists suggest that just a 10-minute walk a day can benefit our mood and help relieve anxiety and depression. Just a 10-minute walk can help with some of these symptoms. Journaling is a really powerful tool, and research has actually shown that people struggling with PTSD can find benefits in journaling, including decreasing flashbacks, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts. Journaling is a great way of expressing and reflecting our feelings each day. It's also a great aid to counseling because you can take it with you as you come up with things that you'd like to process. Utilize meditation and other mindfulness techniques. This can be really helpful to calm your body and your mind. People say, well, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is a state of mind where you focus on the now. This allows you to acknowledge and accept your thoughts, feelings, and all of your sensations without any judgment. You can Google techniques to do this, but in general, mindfulness just involves a breathing practice and awareness of body and mind. There are a lot of apps for smartphones that can assist with this as well. Discover your spirituality. Spend time in prayer. Join a church. This can be organized religion or any activity that makes you feel centered. It could be yoga, connecting to a higher power. However you connect, find that. That connection is powerful. Recite daily affirmations. I do this every day with an app on my phone. Even when I don't feel like it, I say the affirmations because keeping a positive mindset is important and it makes a difference when you do it all the time. Have structure. Yes, have a daily schedule. Even in the middle of the COVID restrictions, you can have a schedule. Get up, eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner at a certain time. Exercise at a certain time. Plan something spiritual, plan something educational. Having structure has been shown to help in lessening the symptoms of trauma. Social media is loaded with triggers for people. Be smart about social media and other media consumption of whatever type it is, whether it's television or movies, Netflix. Avoid watching programs that will trigger bad memories. When you're scrolling all over social media, you never know what you're going to see that someone has posted. Social media is far from the healthiest place to be on a regular basis. Yes, there are many inspirational people and sites on social media, but whether or not you see them depends on who you're following and who your friends are. It's also important to have appropriate anger management. It's okay and necessary to feel and work through the anger that you have about the abuse. I had a professor in grad school. She was a doctor, and she shared with us that she always had a box of new glass dishes from the dollar store in her garage. When she felt stressed and angry, she would go to her garage and she would get those dishes and break each one by one, by throwing it against the side of her brick house. She said it was the best release for her anger that she'd ever found. She told us that then she immediately cleaned up her mess, drove straight to the dollar store, bought another set of cheap dishes because she never wanted to be without a set of dishes to break if she felt like she needed to. That's a unique option utilized by an incredibly successful doctor. The point is, she knew what worked for her and she had a plan. Maintaining sobriety is a lifelong endeavor. Realizing how our trauma is intertwined with our addiction is necessary to maintaining long-term sobriety. When we've numbed ourselves for so long, feelings can flood us with pain and overwhelm us during recovery. We have to recognize that pain as progress. That might sound odd, but it's true. If we are feeling the pain, then we aren't numb anymore. And in spite of all the years that we thought we had made our hearts impenetrable, we discover that our heart still feels pain, which means it's still working and we can move forward with healing. The only way to process feelings is to feel them. Keep in mind that if you have survived the trauma, and you have, then you are strong enough to survive the recovery. You can heal. Increase your belief in your own power to overcome and resolve past abuse issues and create a new life. Happiness does exist on the other side of suffering. My life is proof of that. As survivors, when we begin to believe that a happy and healthy life is possible, everything changes. You are not forever broken, and you are so much more than anything anyone ever did to you. You are strong, you are courage-filled, and you most definitely are not alone. I am one of many, many people who will fight for you. There is pain and there is peace. The healing that happens is the bridge that takes you from the pain to the peace, but you have to have the courage to walk it. Healing doesn't feel good in the early stages, but don't quit. Regardless of what you're recovering from, even if you're recovering from surgery, healing is gradual. It's a process and it hurts in the beginning. Don't allow your past to dictate the future. You've worked hard to become sober, and you've worked hard to maintain that sobriety. You put a lot of your life and time into it. If you're a survivor, it's equally important to heal from your trauma. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you've been sober for so many years that trauma couldn't possibly affect you now. I have a friend who had been sober for over 20 years. He was very diligent in his sobriety, but he never dealt with his trauma. And that trauma snuck up on him, and in one day, he lost it all. When we're in the beginning stages of sobriety, we like to say things like, give it time. Rome wasn't built in a day. And that's true. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it did burn in one. Don't let that happen to your sobriety. Embrace your healing. A 12-step program isn't a replacement for healing from trauma. Sobriety and healing from trauma do go hand in hand, though. Individual counseling is one of the most powerful tools to help process your trauma. I realize not everyone will choose to engage in therapy, though, and that's fine. There are infinite ways to find your own way. So I've included many popular online options for counseling and support. I listed them in the PowerPoint presentation. Many of them are free. You can choose between texting or emailing, talking on the phone, or receiving a referral to see someone in person. I hope you'll check it out. You deserve to heal.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. I was teary-eyed multiple times. So the sheer level of, I mean, the magnitude of how many people have struggled, I mean, it just is overwhelming. We do have some questions. I'm going to start asking you those. So the first person's, and so challenging. I was sexually abused by someone a year older. I became effeminate, wanted to become a girl, sex addict, was called a whore, had urges to become a whore. I don't know how much of this is due to my past and what is me. I mean, if you're called a whore at 26, you're not in control of sexual urges. But they don't necessarily identify as a sex addict. But the question is, I certainly am firmer in my behavior now, not a sex addict, but the past makes me feel filthy to be called a prostitute. It's so shameful. I don't know what to do. I wish I had more self-control over my addiction. And, you know, I was thinking, like, we don't have control over our addiction, but all of those techniques and tools that you shared. But do you have any comments on this? You know, the abuse and how it's played out now?
Well, first of all, like, I'm incredibly sorry for the pain that you experienced and the trauma you experienced, and then society reaching out and being so cruel back. I'm just very, very sorry for that, because you deserve to live and be happy and be whoever you want to be. Does the trauma affect your choices and your lifestyle today? Absolutely. They didn't say whether or not they had ever had any healing or treatment, and the feeling of feeling filthy and not having boundaries for your body and not being able to set limits, it sounds like, definitely are signs of pain and unresolved trauma, lack of boundaries, and you know, so of course, those are all associated with your childhood trauma. I would think that you probably recognized yourself in a lot of what I was saying. And, but you can absolutely heal. You can absolutely change those things because you're worthy. One of the things that I stated in there was that many survivors have feelings of worthlessness. And when you said you feel the shame and you feel filthy, that means you don't value yourself. And so that absolutely is related to that trauma and that unhealed trauma. So I hope that you can get into some healing type of program, because you're so much more than absolutely anything that you've done, whatever your lifestyle has been, none of it matters. You have a heart that's beating and you deserve to heal and find your happiness.
So for those of you, just a reminder, we are not doing the request to share. So you can IM me any questions, and as long as we have time. If you did not already see it, Maintaining Sobriety, at the top of your screen, you can download the PowerPoints. As Kelley mentioned, there's a lot of great resources in there. You can download that and save it. Next question is, what is the best advice to give if you think a child is being abused? Like what can you say or do either to the child, or can you intervene on the situation?
Obviously, if you have concerns and you believe something is happening, you can always call. You can call Children's Services and you can tell them, this is what I'm seeing. These are my thoughts. I don't know about in other states. In Ohio, you can report to Children's Services anonymously, but I don't know about other states, what the laws are there. It's a tricky situation. You don't want to quiz a child. You don't want to put thoughts in a child's mind. There are situations where sometimes children say things that can be misinterpreted and we can think, oh, what's going on? But maybe that's not it. And then there's a lot of times too that children can say things that we don't recognize as them trying to disclose abuse. And that's what happened in my case. I tried one time to disclose my words. Obviously, I was a little girl. I didn't use the proper words. And so the person didn't understand what was happening to me. But if you do suspect abuse and you're not a mandated reporter or a teacher or whatever, where you have clear-cut guidelines of what you need to do, you can certainly call your Children's Services, DFS. I know every state calls it something different, but you can tell them these are my concerns, and they can at least send someone out to check it out. If you have enough information for them, a lot of times they can't do a lot. If someone just says, "Well, I think it," it's a hard kind of situation until you have some evidence. But certainly, I would make the call. If I thought a child was being abused, I would make that call, because even if nothing happens, I did what I could do.
I appreciate that. And it's a fine line on both sides of it. You don't want to accuse somebody unnecessarily, but when I'm reading those numbers, the magnitude of the problem, we've got to do something. So next question is, I understand it wasn't my fault being abused from my brother too at age 5, but I don't believe it's not your fault. It's empty and means nothing to me. I actually carry a lot of anger, and am codependent, which that's a whole nother conversation, who is always looking for long-term attachments. Just a reminder, anybody trying to request a share, I'm going to X you out of there. You can IM me if you've got questions. I actually carry a lot of anger and I'm codependent, who is always looking for long-term attachments. How do I begin to break free from this? They add, I keep relapsing. I want to stop the pain. Please help me.
Yeah. And again, I'm sorry for your pain. I'm sorry that someone who should have protected you hurt you. And because I experienced that myself, I know that pain, and it's such a betrayal. So you have every right to feel the anger you feel. I don't know if did the person say that, I don't think they said if they'd ever been in treatment, correct?
I didn't hear that they were in treatment or had gotten professional help on that. I heard the anger and the breaking of the plates came to mind,
Yeah. Because the worthless feelings that they said they had, the anger, all of those feelings, the relapsing, I believe you said,
yes.
That there'd been several relapses. All of that is just a sign that you're trying so desperately to numb that pain, to make that wound go away. And that wound isn't going to get better until we address it. And so maybe some of the programs that I put on here that are online, the RAIN website, RAINN.org, is amazing. It's completely free. You can text people 24/7. You can email, you can chat, you can call. And that gives you an outlet. Even if you're not ready to try and get some counseling or anything yet, it gives you an outlet to talk to someone, to get that off your soul. Everybody's in a different level of their healing journey, and just all of those services that they provide. I mean, I wish I could have had someone I could have just texted. And so I would really reach out to one of those online services, because there's no magic cure for the pain you're feeling. There are no words that I can speak that are gonna all of a sudden make it better. You have to begin to heal and process through all of the pain that you have. And it breaks my heart, because you said it doesn't help you at all when people say the abuse is not your fault. People who aren't survivors of sexual abuse don't realize how strong that feeling is in victims. And many times because that's what the perpetrators make you feel like. And so it just breaks my heart that you're in such pain. And I hope that you'll reach out to RAIN or one of the other places. A lot of them are free. Certainly connect with me on social media. My Instagram is @GunterKelley. My website is kelleygunter.com. I try to eventually respond to all the messages, but really your soul is begging to be heard. And so I really hope that you'll reach out for one of those programs that can at least start getting some of that pain released for you.
So, and this kind of correlates. This person is a sponsor, and she, I think it's she, as most of my sponsees were sexually abused, and I don't know how to help them in working with them. One of them broke off our relationship, sponsor, at 2 months sobriety because her trauma therapist told her to. So I'm thinking some of the resources that you shared, including RAINN.org, which is Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, providing some of the resources like that, or your website, et cetera, might be good. But what else can you suggest?
I think some of the coping skills that I even talked about with journaling and those things can help clients. If this person's therapist told them this relationship with your sponsor is not beneficial to you right now, I don't know the parameters for why that decision was made. So I can't speak on why that was. I mean, there could be a million reasons why the therapist thought this isn't helping you right now. And so I don't really know, but as far as why the client decided to end that. But when you're trying to help survivors, listening to them without judging. And the bottom line is, no matter, you could be Einstein, you could have the wisdom of Solomon. There are no words that just make it better for someone. But everybody needs someone who can listen, someone who can say, I love you no matter what. I think you're worthy. I am your friend. And because it's just like when I used to be a grief counselor at hospice, and people always say, I don't know what to say at a funeral. There's nothing to say that's going to bring that person back. Well, there's nothing that you can say that's going to erase this trauma. But if you're a sponsor or a friend or a family member or a colleague, whatever, you're a church member with someone, listening to them in a non-judgmental fashion, because many survivors are just dying inside, but you'd never know it. You would have never known that about me. No one would have ever known what my truth was.
There are so many good questions. I don't even know how to get to. This is a really big one. We only have 2 minutes left.
Well, I mean, I can stay a little bit longer if you need.
Well, they have a boundary on.
Okay.
So we may stay on, but yeah, we want people to go.
Don't help the boundary.
I know, I'm trying. So this is, how do you learn to trust God when He allowed this abuse to happen?
Oh, this is such it brings tears to my eyes, because my strength and my healing and Everything I have is my faith in God. And there were many, many times that I said, what kind of God allows this to happen to a child? Over and over and over. And again, we all are different with it. But what I know in my journey is my belief and my faith is that God is the only reason I even survived it. God is the reason I'm here and I'm speaking about it. And so when I was in my darkest moments, many times I wished I was dead. I would pray and be like, just let me die. And so I understand the darkness. I'm not trying to minimize the darkness, but getting out of the darkness allowed me to be able to look at things in hindsight and know my strength came from God. And there will always be a battle between good and evil on this earth. And when we heal, we allow for something beautiful to be made out of the pain. And I know that sounds like probably an answer that you've heard a million times, but it really is the truth. For me and my faith is that once I finally just surrendered it and said, I trust you, God, no matter what, I trust you. Then I was able to really begin to heal and move out of the blame stage and say, well, let me heal and become everything you created me to be and overcome this adversity. So, but I do understand. I mean, I screamed at the sky and through the Bible. I mean, it's okay to feel those feelings. It's okay to be mad at God. God can handle that. He wouldn't be much of a God if he couldn't, would he? I mean, so I would just, if you're a Christian and you're struggling with that, I would say talk to God and tell him truthfully how you're feeling, genuinely how you're feeling. And that's how I processed through that. But it was a gradual process.
I concur. I'm going to ask the next question. I was sexually abused by someone my own age, still too young, driven by pornography. I don't want to channel my hurt into being an abuser myself. I feel like a hungry ghost. I want back what was taken from me, but that isn't reality. Events of the past have painted my reality today. This person's in therapy and these events occurred nearly 20 years ago. But the message of like, I'm afraid now I'm going to become an abuser. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Well, I think sometimes first of all, again, I'm so sorry for your pain. I think everybody needs to hear that. You deserved better. I think the media a lot of times really portrays the message, if you were abused, then you're going to be an abuser. And the truth is, all abusers were abused, but not everyone who is abused becomes an abuser. And, that's a difficult statistic to find any research on because there are so many perpetrators who never get caught. So to have any valid, believable data is kind of difficult for how many people actually become offenders. But I think that's a normal fear to have because you don't want to become what destroyed you. And, did they say they were in therapy?
Yes.
Because that's something I'm sure they've addressed in therapy, but you don't want to become the monsters who were real in your life. And so I think the thing is when you have the fear of those things, then that's kind of those intrusive thoughts maybe where it comes back all the time. Am I going to do this? Am I going to be this? And working through those. If you've ever had behaviors where you're actually violating and abusing someone, that's something different. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I know a lot of the people I work with in life coaching say, I'm just afraid I'm going to become a perpetrator. I heard that, all victims become perpetrators. That's not true. That isn't true. But perpetrators, I don't believe are born, hurt people. And there are people who never healed. And so the cycle continued. But addressing those feelings and not being afraid to speak about them, go through them, process them with your therapist, journal about them. The more you try to avoid a thought, the more it's going to haunt you. And so go in there and really see, what's behind it. And hopefully it will calm some of the fears that you have.
So finally, quickly, there are people that are outside the U.S. Are those resources only for within the U.S., like RAINN, RAINN.org, or can that be used if you're in Canada or outside as well?
I'm sure they're everywhere. They're online, so they're virtual. So I'm sure, I don't know about the phone lines, but emailing and messaging on the computer, I'm sure all of that is available worldwide because it's the internet. So I'm not sure, like I said, about the phone lines to actually call, but they should be able to email or chat or, message on the computer.
Great. Okay, so for those of you joining us, we'll be back in 55 minutes with Troy Love. Reach out to Kelley at her website. Go ahead and give your website again.
My website is kelleygunter.com, and my Instagram is @GunterKelley, and that's GUNTERKELLEY.
I was going to say, and it's an EY on Kelley. So
Right.
thank you, Kelley. This has been fantastic. So appreciate
Sure.
it. Thank you, everyone who's joined us, and see you in 55 minutes. Bye.
Okay. Bye.